My name is Talia Morgan. I am 34 years old, a decorated officer in the United States Navy, and I have spent most of my life proving that I belong where very few women stand. I thought I had faced the harshest storms. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. "Useless soldier," my dad shouted across the military tribunal. His voice cut through the air like a gunshot, sharp and merciless. I felt the room freeze around me. Every eye in that grand chamber turned toward me. The weight of their gaze pressed against my chest, where my scars still ached like fresh wounds. My father, a retired colonel with more medals than I could count, stood on the witness stand, pointing at me as if I were an imposter in uniform. "Remove your uniform," he added, his voice cracking, though he tried to hide it. For a moment, I wondered if this was truly happening. The tribunal judge raised an eyebrow, the scribbling of pens stopped, and even the distant hum of the air conditioning felt muted. The shame was unbearable, but not because I believed his words. I knew what I had survived. I knew the price I had paid to stand here. My humiliation came from something deeper. The man who once taught me how to shoot straight, how to stand tall, was now trying to tear me down in front of everyone. My breath hitched, a painful reminder of the scars under my ribs, those ugly marks carved into my skin during a mission that nearly ended my life. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I refused to cry, refused to let him see my pain. The chair beneath me screeched as I stood. The tribunal hall smelled of old wood and cold metal, and for a fleeting second, I imagined I was back in that jungle, bleeding and crawling, fighting for breath. My father's words rang again in my ears, but I said nothing. My silence was louder than any protest. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling as I reached for the buttons on my jacket. The tribunal fell into an eerie silence. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt. Slowly, I unbuttoned my dress blues, my motions deliberate, almost mechanical. When I slid my jacket off, I could feel the weight of the room shift. My undershirt clung to me, damp from the tension, but I did not hesitate. I pulled the fabric up, just enough for the truth to speak for me. Gasps filled the chamber. The scars across my ribs were raw and jagged, twisting like burned ropes against pale skin. Two hard lumps, the fragments of metal that the surgeons could not safely remove, protruded beneath my flesh. They had become a part of me, as permanent as my heartbeat. The first to break the silence was Admiral Foster. His voice, usually commanding, faltered. "Those scars, oh God." He rose slowly from his seat, his eyes locked on mine, as if seeing me for the first time. Not as a soldier, not as an officer, but as someone who had walked through hell and returned carrying pieces of it inside her. My father staggered back, his face drained of color. The fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by something far more fragile, fear and regret. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. His own accusations had just destroyed him. He collapsed back into his seat, staring at the floor as though it might swallow him whole. I stood there, exposed, but I did not flinch. Let them see. Let them understand what the reports and commendations never could. These scars were not trophies. They were evidence of every mile I crawled, every teammate I dragged through the mud when I should have been dead. The room was frozen, the tribunal judges holding their pens midair. No one dared to break the moment. The silence was heavier than any verdict they could deliver. I lowered my shirt slowly and fastened my jacket, my hands steady now. My voice, when it came, was calm but cold, carrying years of unspoken pain. "You call me useless," I said softly, turning toward my father. "But I survived a mission that no one else was meant to survive. I carried men twice my size out of that jungle while bleeding through my own uniform. I fought not for medals, but for lives." My father's shoulders sagged. He looked smaller, older, like the weight of his own words had crushed him. He could not look me in the eye. I let the silence linger before speaking again. My mind flashed back to that night in the jungle, the crack of gunfire, the stench of smoke, the scream of a man I refused to leave behind. I remembered how every step felt like my last, how the pain in my ribs was so sharp I thought I would collapse before reaching the extraction point. But I didn't. I kept going because someone had to. The tribunal watched me as though I were a ghost. They had read about that mission, but they didn't know the real story. The chaos, the betrayal, the fact that we had been sent into a trap, no one would admit. Those scars were the only proof that I hadn't imagined it all. I looked back at the room, my gaze steady. How do you call your own daughter useless when her scars tell a story you never dared to hear? My words were not just for my father, but for every judge, every officer in that chamber. Admiral Foster cleared his throat, his voice hushed but firm. Lieutenant Morgan, we need to hear your side of the story. I straightened my jacket and took a step forward. If they wanted the truth, I would give it to them, all of it, starting with the night I should have died. The tribunal adjourned in a haze of whispers and heavy glances, but Admiral Foster's eyes stayed fixed on me. He approached with a measured step, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Morgan, he said quietly, come with me. There was no room for refusal in his tone. I followed him down a long corridor, lined with portraits of men who had built their reputations on valor. I wondered how many of their scars were hidden under crisp uniforms, and how many of their stories had been silenced for the sake of appearances. The private room was stark and silent, its walls the color of steel. A single table stood in the middle, a notepad resting on its surface. Foster gestured for me to sit. He took a seat opposite me, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table. I need the truth, he said, his voice low but firm, about what really happened out there. My breath caught in my throat. Truth had a way of cutting deeper than any bullet. I had rehearsed my answers for months, every time someone tried to reduce my survival to luck. Yet with Foster's gaze on me, it felt like the weight of that night returned all at once. Before I could speak, a memory of my father's voice rose in my mind, sharp as the day he said it. Don't turn failure into an excuse, Talia. A soldier either accomplishes the mission or dies trying. Those words had burned into me since childhood, shaping every step I took. He didn't care about bruises, blood, or the impossible odds. To him, success was the only proof of worth. I almost died, I said finally, my tone steady, but laced with something raw. I was sent into an operation that was doomed from the start. We were told it would be a quiet extraction, no resistance, no risks. I paused, my fingers tightening against the table. But the jungle was waiting for us. It wasn't just bad intel, it felt like we were led into a trap. Foster's eyes narrowed, as though he'd expected me to say it. Go on, he urged. His voice carried the weight of both authority and curiosity, as if he already suspected that the official report was far from the whole truth. Admiral Foster's gaze sharpened as he leaned closer. The report says you followed standard protocol, he said, his tone measured but probing. Yet every detail you've shared so far tells me something doesn't add up. What's missing from the official record, Lieutenant? I inhaled slowly, steadying the storm inside me. Almost everything that truly happened, I replied, my voice low but firm. The official report claims we deployed at 2100 hours, but I remember checking my watch as we were airlifted in. Our boots hit the ground at 20:35. Someone tampered with the timeline, cutting out nearly 30 minutes. His brow furrowed. 30 minutes? That's not a clerical error. What else? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to hold back, to keep the pain buried, but I knew that silence had already cost too much. We were supposed to have a secondary support team. They were meant to track us remotely and relay intel as we advanced. But 5 minutes into the jungle, their signal vanished. No updates, no coordinates, nothing. It was like they ceased to exist. Foster's expression darkened, his hand tightening into a fist on the table. That's not in the report, he said, almost to himself. No, sir, I confirmed. The report talks about an ambush and my exceptional courage under fire, but it doesn't explain why we walked into a kill zone with no warning. I still don't know why we were sent there without proper backup. None of it makes sense. Not the silence on comms, not the broken intel, not the missing 30 minutes. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, as if the truth itself was suffocating us. I kept my gaze on Foster's face, searching for any hint of recognition or hidden knowledge. I wish I could give you clear answers, I said finally, my voice quieter. But even I don't fully understand how everything went so wrong. All I know is that it felt deliberate, as if someone wanted us to fail. Foster leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. Then we'll start by finding out who rewrote your mission before you even set foot on that ground, he said, his voice carrying a cold resolve. Admiral Foster's eyes hardened as he studied me, his silence carrying more weight than any question. Lieutenant, he said finally, his voice slower now, this is starting to look like more than bad intel. Someone wanted these details buried. His words echoed in the sterile room, sharp and unsettling. I could see the thoughts forming behind his steady gaze, calculations he wasn't ready to share out loud. He tapped a finger against the table, once, twice, before leaning in. "Do you know anyone who might have had access to your mission orders?" I hesitated. My mind flicked back to that morning, the day before the operation, when my father called me into his office. He had looked at me in a way I couldn't read. His jaw clenched, his eyes colder than usual. I remembered his words, flat and heavy. "Not every order is meant to be questioned. Do what you're told, Talia, and don't ask why." "I don't know for certain," I admitted, my voice tense. But my father had connections, old friends who still hold advisory roles. One of them was on the approval board for that mission. His name is General Harris. Saying the name made my stomach twist. Harris had known me since I was a child, always boasting about my father's legacy. Foster's eyes narrowed. "Harris signed off on the operation logs," he murmured. I saw his signature in the chain of command. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the sharp, unreadable look my father gave me before deployment made terrible sense. Had he known? Had he suspected that the mission was anything but routine? I clenched my fists on the table, feeling the scar tissue beneath my ribs ache. Before I left, he told me not to mess this up. It felt different that time, like he knew something was waiting for me out there. I dismissed it as his usual tough love, but now I'm not sure. Admiral Foster's voice dropped, quiet but decisive. "We're not dealing with coincidence. We're dealing with a cover-up, and it might involve people you and I both know." I reached into the inner pocket of my uniform and placed a small black USB drive on the table. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of every unanswered question. "This," I said, my voice firm, "is everything I managed to save. Raw radio logs, satellite timestamps, even partial GPS trails. I made copies before the official files were locked." Admiral Foster's brows knitted together as he picked it up. "You held on to this?" "Yes, sir," I replied. I knew the official report was missing key segments. The only reason I survived was because I paid attention to every irregular signal that night. When I recovered, I pulled whatever data I could from our comm devices before they were wiped clean for security purposes. I didn't trust that the truth would survive otherwise. He plugged the USB into his secure laptop and scrolled through the files with sharp, deliberate keystrokes. I watched his face shift from curiosity to something darker. He froze on a particular timestamp log, his eyes narrowing. "This mission was officially recorded to have started at 2100 hours, he said slowly. "But according to this raw data, your team was deployed at 2035. That's a 25-minute gap right here." "Keep looking," I said quietly. He clicked again, his face growing pale as more anomalies appeared. "There's a missing block of 40 minutes, he muttered. The logs jumped from 21:05 to 21:45 as if nothing happened during that time. No radio chatter, no telemetry. It's like someone cut out the heart of the operation. My chest tightened. Hearing it out loud felt like reliving that nightmare. "That's when we were ambushed," I said. "All the chaos, the screams, the calls for help, it's gone, erased, like it never existed." Admiral Foster looked up at me, his jaw tight. "This isn't just negligence. Someone scrubbed this data. Someone didn't want anyone to know what really happened." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Now you see why I can't let it go. That missing 40 minutes, it cost lives, and I intend to find out who's responsible." The smell of burnt gunpowder still lingers in my memory, sharp and metallic, mixed with the damp scent of earth. I remember the thud of my boots hitting the ground after we dropped from the helicopter, the rotor wash whipping dirt into my face. The night was too still, the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. Even with the adrenaline flooding my veins, I knew something was wrong. I led my 5-person recon team through the undergrowth, moving quickly but cautiously. Each of us carried the weight of what was supposed to be a simple extraction mission. My orders were clear: retrieve Dr. Harlow, an intelligence asset who had been captured by guerrilla fighters, and get out without leaving a trace. Command said the enemy presence would be minimal. I wanted to believe that, but years of experience had taught me to trust my instincts over any sanitized briefing. The ground was soft beneath my boots, mud pulling at every step, and the heavy air clung to my skin. I gave hand signals for silence and spread the team into formation. Ruiz, my comms officer, was behind me, his radio gear humming quietly. Kim and Diaz flanked left, while Alvarez stayed close, scanning the tree line with steady eyes. Every sound was amplified in that jungle. Leaves brushing against fabric, the metallic click of a safety catch. I raised a fist, signaling a halt, and crouched low. My fingers traced the dirt, feeling for vibrations. It was a habit I'd learned from older soldiers. The earth speaks if you listen long enough. But all I felt was the cold, damp soil pressing against my gloves. I whispered into the headset. Team, check bearings, maintain line of sight. My voice was calm, though my heartbeat had started to drum harder. Something about the darkness ahead felt heavy, almost watchful, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I pushed the unease aside and motioned for the team to advance. The path grew narrower as we pushed deeper, branches scraping our gear, the canopy swallowing what little moonlight remained. Every step took us closer to a trap we couldn't see, but that I could almost sense, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. The ambush came without warning. 1 second, the jungle was eerily quiet. The next, it erupted like a thunderclap. A burst of automatic gunfire tore through the night, the sound shattering the silence as if glass had splintered inside my head. I dropped to the ground, my instincts firing faster than thought, as bullets sliced through branches above me. "Contact, left flank!" I shouted into the headset, my voice nearly drowned by the roar of gunfire. I saw Kim spin and fall, his rifle tumbling from his hands as a bullet ripped into his shoulder. The sharp smell of burning metal filled the air as mines detonated nearby, shaking the ground beneath us. Dirt and smoke exploded upward, stinging my face, and I felt the vibration crawl into my bones. I crawled behind a fallen tree, my breath ragged, every nerve screaming. "Return fire! Find cover!" I yelled, signaling Alvarez and Diaz. The night turned into chaos, a symphony of explosions, shouting, and the tearing sound of rounds snapping past us. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting. It felt like being trapped inside a glass room that had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. Every gunshot was a shard cutting into my thoughts. I tried to focus, but the cries of my team kept pulling me apart. Ruiz, only a few feet behind me, clutched his side and screamed. The radio unit on his back sparked and went dark, severing our last connection to command. I remember pressing my cheek against the wet ground, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Stay with me!" I shouted, crawling toward Ruiz, my fingers slipping in the mud. The enemy's bullets kept raining down, hitting the tree trunk inches from my head. The bark exploded into fragments, each splinter biting into my skin. We were pinned, nowhere to run, surrounded by an enemy that had known we were coming. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath a gamble. And yet I knew I couldn't freeze. Not now, not when they needed me to lead, even if it meant walking through hell itself. The next shot tore through the air so close I felt the heat graze my side. Then came the impact, white-hot, sharp as lightning, when a fragment of shrapnel ripped into my ribs. I gasped, the breath knocked out of me, my lungs burning as though they were being crushed. My fingers instinctively clutched my side, and all I felt was wet warmth seeping through my uniform. Pain screamed up my spine, leaving me momentarily frozen. But Ruiz's cry cut through the haze, raw and terrified. He was lying exposed, bleeding from his thigh, his eyes wide and searching for me. I bit down hard, forcing my body to move. I knew if I stopped for even a second, we would all be gone. "Ruiz, hold on," I shouted, my voice hoarse. I pushed myself forward, the pain slicing deeper with every inch I crawled. My left arm trembled violently, but I grabbed him by the vest and dragged with everything I had. The mud made it harder, sucking at our bodies as I pulled him behind the fallen tree that served as our only cover. I didn't have time to think. Diaz was still out there, sprawled on the ground near the edge of the clearing, his weapon just out of reach. Bullets whizzed overhead like angry hornets. Without hesitation, I crawled back out, my ribs screaming with every movement. I grabbed Diaz by his harness and hauled him back, my knees digging into the wet earth, my breath coming in short, desperate bursts. Each pull felt like my muscles were tearing apart, but the alternative, leaving them there, was unthinkable. A round hit the ground so close I felt dirt and debris spray across my face, but I kept going. When I finally dragged Diaz behind cover, I collapsed beside them for a brief second, my vision swimming. Stay low, stay with me, I told them, my voice shaking but firm. Even as my own blood soaked into the soil, I knew I had no choice but to lead. The mission had already fallen apart, but survival meant not letting anyone else die here. The night turned into a blur of mud, blood, and desperation. With Ruiz and Diaz barely conscious, I knew I had to move them before the enemy closed in. Alvarez was still alive but badly shaken, clutching a bleeding arm as he tried to reload his rifle. I grabbed his shoulder. "We're leaving now," I ordered, my voice low but unyielding. He nodded, his face pale under the dim light filtering through the trees. The jungle felt alive with danger, every shadow a threat, every sound a reminder that we were still in their sights. I hoisted Ruiz first, slinging his arm over my shoulder, my ribs screaming with each step. Pain shot through me like hot knives, and I had to bite down on my own hand to stifle a scream. The taste of dirt and blood filled my mouth, but I couldn't let any sound escape that would give us away. "Keep moving," I whispered, urging Diaz and Alvarez to follow as I dragged Ruiz through the underbrush. The weight of his body felt like it would crush me, but I kept pulling, step by brutal step. The night air was heavy and thick, clinging to my skin, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. When we reached a patch of relative cover, I set Ruiz down and went back for Diaz. He tried to protest, his lips trembling. "You can't carry both of us," he whispered. "Yes, I can," I shot back. I didn't have time to argue. I grabbed him under his arms, ignoring the agony in my ribs, and dragged him forward, one slow crawl after another. My boots sank into the muck, and I left a trail of blood behind us, but stopping was never an option. By the time I reached Ruiz again, my arms were trembling so hard I could barely grip my rifle. "We're almost out," I told them, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Every inch of me hurt, but something inside refused to break. I would not let the jungle take them, even if it tore me apart piece by piece. When I opened my eyes, the world was white and sterile. The sounds of the jungle were gone, replaced by the steady beeping of monitors and the faint hum of hospital machinery. My chest felt like it had been split apart, a searing pain radiating from my ribs with every breath. I tried to sit up, but a sharp agony pinned me down. A nurse appeared beside me, her voice gentle yet firm. "Lieutenant Morgan, you need to stay still. You're safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign. I turned my head slightly and saw bandages wrapped tight around my torso, stained faintly with dried blood. "Your injuries were severe," the nurse continued, her tone softening. "2 fragments of shrapnel are still lodged near your rib cage. Removing them would risk puncturing your lungs. The doctors decided it's safer to leave them in." Her words sank in slowly. I glanced down at my side, feeling the hard, alien shapes pressing beneath my skin. I traced my fingers lightly over the dressing, and it hit me. Those fragments would be with me forever, reminders etched deep into my flesh. I could still feel the echo of the ambush in my bones, like the jungle had branded me for surviving. A doctor entered, checking my vitals. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. "You lost a lot of blood. If your team hadn't gotten you out when they did, you wouldn't be here. But the damage is permanent. You'll heal, but those scars, they're not going away." Later, when I was alone, I lifted the edge of the bandage just enough to see. The sight of my ribs, marred, bruised, and marked with angry stitches, made me catch my breath. I pressed my hand over them, feeling both the pain and the proof that I had endured something no report could ever capture. Those scars weren't just wounds. They were a story carved into me, a silent testimony to everything we survived when no one believed we could. And in that sterile room, I swore I would never let the truth of that night be erased. Weeks after the tribunal, when the noise of rumors began to fade, I sat alone in my quarters, sorting through reports that never seemed to tell the full story. The mission was officially closed, buried under layers of bureaucratic language. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still hiding in the shadows. Late that night, my laptop pinged with a new email. The sender's name was masked. Nothing but a string of random characters. The subject line simply read, "Look deeper into Orion Systems." I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. Orion Systems, one of the biggest defense contractors tied to our operations in the South Pacific. I had seen their name on equipment manifests, on encrypted communication relays, but never questioned it. The email was short, just a single line. Your mission was not a failure, it was a test. My breath caught. A test? My pulse quickened as I read the words over and over, each time feeling them cut deeper. There was a PDF attachment, a compressed file marked with a timestamp that matched the night of the ambush. I hesitated, scanning the file for security risks before opening it. Inside were fragments of intercepted communications, lines of code, call logs, and what looked like satellite path data. Several entries referenced predictive drone mapping and the phrase live field variables. My heart sank. It felt like confirmation of what I had suspected. We weren't just caught in an ambush. We were being monitored, studied, as if our suffering was part of an experiment. The air in the room turned heavy. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, the glow reflecting off the framed photo of my team. Ruiz, Kim, Diaz, faces that still haunted me in quiet moments. Was our blood just data to them? The thought hit me like a physical blow. If Orion Systems had manipulated our mission, then the trap we walked into wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The morning after I received the anonymous email, my phone buzzed with a call from an unlisted number. I answered cautiously, expecting silence or a wrong number. Instead, I heard Admiral Foster's voice, low and deliberate. "Lieutenant Morgan, we need to talk. Not here, not on record. Meet me at the observation deck in 1 hour." There was no room for hesitation. I arrived early, scanning the quiet space before he stepped out from the shadows, his face taut with concern. "You've been digging," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. "And I think you found something I've been trying to confirm." I pulled up the encrypted file from my phone, showing him the snippets of intercepted logs. "Someone inside this chain of command knew exactly what would happen that night," I said. "The ambush wasn't just bad intel, it was staged. And Orion Systems was watching every move we made." He studied the screen for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "This confirms my suspicions," he muttered. "There's a leak somewhere high up. Someone gave the green light for a mission they knew would fail, and then they buried the evidence. Your team was bait, Talia." His words landed like a hammer blow, even though part of me had already believed it. "Do you think my father knew?" I asked quietly, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. Foster hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but I do know Harris, your father's old friend, was on the final approval board for this operation. If there's a thread to pull, it starts with him." The thought of Harris, a man who once gave me my first Navy Challenge coin, now being tied to this betrayal, made my stomach turn. I clenched my fist, forcing my voice to steady. "If there's someone on the inside, we'll expose them. I won't let my team's suffering be written off as a footnote." Foster nodded. "Then we work together, quietly. We dig until there's nowhere left for them to hide." 2 nights later, as I reviewed the encrypted files again, another message appeared in my secure inbox. The sender identified himself only as former Orion engineer. My heart pounded as I opened the email. There was a single audio file attached, labeled with the chilling phrase, "Test drone debrief." I plugged in my headphones, pressing play with a mixture of dread and curiosity. A man's voice filled my ears, shaky but urgent. "If you're hearing this, you need to know the truth," he began. "Orion Systems used your unit as a live experiment. They were testing a predictive drone system, one designed to map enemy ambush responses in real time. Your mission wasn't compromised by chance. It was orchestrated. We were ordered to feed false intel to your command, to see how well the algorithm could adapt under chaos." I froze, bile rising in my throat. He continued, voice breaking. "When we saw the casualties, some of us objected. We were told it was part of the data. They said the losses were acceptable, collateral for progress. That's when I quit. I couldn't live with what we'd done. I stopped the recording and sat in silence, my hands trembling. My team's suffering wasn't just overlooked, it was designed. We were treated as disposable variables in someone's cold calculation of war. The faces of Ruiz, Kim, and Diaz flashed in my mind, and for the first time in months, I felt tears burn my eyes. I forwarded the file to Admiral Foster, adding only one line. "This changes everything." Minutes later, he called me. His voice was grim but resolute. "This is the proof we needed. Orion turned your mission into a weapons test. This is more than a cover-up, Talia. This is criminal." I closed my laptop and stared at the wall, my fists clenched. For the first time since that jungle, I felt a surge of something stronger than fear. It was anger, sharp and unyielding. I knew we had reached a point of no return. I couldn't ignore it any longer. After listening to the recording from the former Orion engineer, I needed answers that no file or report could give me. I drove to my father's house, the same home where he had once polished his metals and drilled his expectations into me. He opened the door, surprised to see me, his stern expression softening for just a second. "Dad," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We need to talk." We sat in his study, a room filled with framed commendations and photos of him shaking hands with generals and politicians. The silence between us was thick. I placed my hands on the table, leaning forward. "I need to know," I began. "How deep were you involved with the group that signed off on my mission? Did you know Harris was part of it? Did you know what Orion Systems was doing?" He stiffened, his gaze shifting from me to the bookshelf behind my shoulder. "Talia, this isn't the place for accusations," he said slowly. "It's not an accusation if it's true," I shot back. "You've been friends with Harris for decades. Did you know they used my team as test subjects?" My voice cracked slightly on the last words, but I didn't back down. He stood, walking to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "War isn't clean," he muttered. "Sometimes decisions are made, compromises we can't undo." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "That's not an answer, SS," I said. "Did you know?" His silence was worse than any denial. He didn't turn to face me. He just sighed, the sound heavy with something I couldn't name, guilt maybe, or fear. When I finally stood to leave, I looked back at him one last time. "I'll find the truth, with or without you," I said. He didn't stop me, didn't offer a single word. The unanswered question followed me out the door like a shadow, heavier than the scars on my ribs. Admiral Foster wasted no time once he had the recording from the former Orion engineer. Within 48 hours, he initiated a quiet but targeted internal investigation. I was called into his office the next morning. His expression was firm, but for the first time, I sensed a glimmer of hope. "We found discrepancies in the mission authorizations," he said. "Two officers in the chain of command, Commander Lee and Captain Morris, have been suspended pending review. Their signatures appear on altered data logs. This is our first real break, Talia." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, heavy and warm. For months I had lived with the weight of unanswered questions, buried under whispers that painted me as reckless or lucky. Now, for the first time, it felt like the truth was winning. "Does this mean—" I started, but he held up a hand. "It's not over yet, but this is a start. We'll keep pressing." Walking out of his office that day, the base felt different. For a fleeting moment, I believed we had turned the tide. Ruiz called me that night, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "We knew you'd get to the bottom of it," he said. "You carried us then, and you're carrying this fight now." I smiled for the first time in weeks. I thought of the scars on my ribs, of all the nights I had stared at them wondering if they were just marks of survival or proof of something greater. Now they felt like symbols of persistence. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. I imagined a world where the people who sent us into that jungle would finally be held accountable. It felt like a victory, small but solid. I didn't know then that this calm would not last. The storm waiting for me was just beginning, and my so-called victory would soon turn into another battle, one far more personal and brutal. My relief lasted barely 3 days. That morning, I woke up to a flood of notifications on my phone. Messages from fellow officers, friends, even reporters. The headlines on military news sites were brutal. Lieutenant Morgan under investigation, hero or liability. Another article called me a reckless operator whose erratic decisions cost lives. I knew immediately this was Orion's work. They had resources, influence, and every reason to discredit me before Foster's investigation dug any deeper. A carefully crafted narrative began to spread, painting me as unstable, a soldier who let emotions override strategy. They questioned my leadership, twisting the ambush into a story of my supposed incompetence. In one article, a so-called anonymous source claimed I ignored safety protocols and led my team into hostile territory without proper coordination. Reading it was like watching my honor bleed out in slow motion. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking with rage. I called Admiral Foster. "They're trying to bury me," I said, my voice tight. They're rewriting the story. I know, he replied, his tone steady. Stay calm. This is exactly what they want, to rattle you and weaken our case. We'll fight this with evidence, not emotions. But it was hard to stay calm when whispers started within the base itself. I overheard 2 junior officers in the mess hall, one of them saying, "Isn't she the one who got her squad slaughtered?" I didn't confront them. I just walked past, my spine straight, though inside I felt the sting of betrayal. For years I had built my reputation on precision, resilience, and loyalty. Now with a few twisted words, Orion was tearing it all apart. They weren't just fighting to protect their secrets. They were fighting to destroy me. I stared at my reflection that night, my fingers grazing the scars on my ribs. They were proof of survival. Yet the world was being convinced they were marks of failure. I realized I was in for a war far dirtier than the jungle had ever been. The worst blow did not come from Orion. It came from my father. I was in Admiral Foster's office when a reporter's alert flashed across the screen behind his desk. The headline punched the air out of me. Retired Colonel Talia Morgan breaks. Silence. My daughter is obsessed, unstable, and not to be trusted. I read it twice, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. His statement was quoted in full. He called me fixated on conspiracy, claimed trauma had distorted my judgment, and said the Navy should protect itself from officers who cannot separate pain from protocol. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Foster stood, turned the screen off, and said my name softly, but it sounded far away, like he was calling me from the other side of a river. I felt something collapse inside me, something that had survived the jungle, the tribunal, and the smear campaign. It was the last thread of faith I had in him. I left the office without saying a word. The hallway felt colder than usual. Every step echoed like a verdict. Outside, the sky was a flat gray, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. I sat on a bench near the flagpole and stared at nothing. For years, he had trained me to endure humiliation without flinching, to push through pain without asking for comfort. He had taught me that weakness was the worst sin a soldier could carry. Now he was using those lessons against me. I replayed his words in my head until they blurred. Obsessed, unstable, not to be trusted. I pressed my hand against my ribs, feeling the faint outline of the fragments under my skin. Those scars had carried me through silence, but they couldn't protect me from this. Betrayal is quieter than gunfire. It doesn't tear flesh, it erodes the ground you thought was solid. When my phone rang, I didn't answer. Not Foster, not Ruiz, not anyone. I sat there until the sun dipped, until the wind picked up, until I could breathe without shaking. Then I stood and made myself a promise. If my father wanted to stand with the men who buried the truth, I would stand alone and unbury it myself. That night, I sat in my quarters with every file, every log, and every audio recording spread across the table like pieces of a broken weapon. My father's betrayal still burned in my chest, but it no longer paralyzed me. It fueled me. Orion could twist the narrative. My father could discredit me in public. But the truth, the unedited, raw truth, was mine, and I would not let anyone bury it again. I spent hours compiling the evidence into a single encrypted drive. Radio logs, satellite timestamps, the whistleblower's recording, photos of the scars on my ribs, taken not as symbols of pity, but as physical proof of what had been done to us. Each file felt like a blade sharpened against the lies that had been built around me. By dawn, I had made my decision. I walked into Admiral Foster's office, my steps heavy but steady. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as if he already sensed what I was about to say. "You've made up your mind," he said. "Yes," I replied, sliding the encrypted drive onto his desk. "We take it to the military council. No more backdoor deals, no more waiting for Orion to strike first. If they want a war of narratives, they're going to hear the real one in front of every ranking officer in this building." He studied me for a long moment. "You realize this could end your career," he said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. "My career isn't worth more than the truth. Those men didn't bleed and die for me to stay silent. I won't let my scars mean nothing." The decision was final. That afternoon, Foster arranged a special session with the military council. As I waited outside the chamber, I felt every ounce of fear and anger pulse through me. This wasn't just a fight for my name anymore. It was a battle for every soldier who had ever been treated as expendable. When my name was called, I walked into the council room with my head high, the weight of truth heavier than any uniform I had ever worn. The council chamber was colder than I expected, a gray-lit amphitheater of rank and caution. I stood at the podium while the encrypted drive mirrored onto a secure screen. Lines of timestamps, radio logs, and unedited audio unspooled before the panel. No one spoke. You could hear the ventilation system humming, the soft clack of a judge's pen against a folder. My father sat in the first row, spine straight but jaw tight, a man trying to hold his own history in place. I walked them through the gaps. Deployment recorded at 2100, boots on ground at 2035. 40 minutes of missing comms during the worst phase of the ambush. Predictive drone terminology embedded inside contractor chatter that never appeared in the official brief. When I pressed play on the engineer's confession, several officers shifted in their seats. Admiral Foster didn't move. He just watched the council watch me. Lieutenant Morgan, one senior member said, "Are you alleging deliberate manipulation of a combat mission by a private contractor with cooperation from officers in this command chain?" I kept my voice even. "I am alleging the data shows that. I am alleging the dead cannot speak for themselves, so I am speaking for them." I felt my father's eyes on me. For once, there was no dismissal in them, no hardened critique. Only tension, confusion, a terror I recognized from the jungle, the terror of realizing you are not in control of the ground beneath you. He glanced at General Harris, seated 2 chairs down the row, and Harris didn't look back. The council recessed for 10 minutes to confer. I sat alone at the edge of the room, my hands folded, the scars under my ribs aching with the kind of pain that is not purely physical. When they returned, the chair read the preliminary finding. There is sufficient cause to open a full criminal and administrative investigation into Operation Halberd and associated contracting protocols. The words struck my father harder than they struck me. His shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in surrender to reality. Truth had finally entered the room, and it was louder than every accusation that had tried to silence it. I did not celebrate. I inhaled, steady and slow, and prepared for the next fight, because evidence opens doors, but courage keeps them open when the powerful rush to slam them shut on principle. When the council granted me the floor again, I knew this was the moment that would either crush me or clear my name forever. I connected the drive and pulled up the drone images, grainy but unmistakable. The first photo showed the enemy staging crates marked with the Orion Systems logo, taken 12 hours before we were deployed. The second showed this predictive drone grid hovering above our landing zone, its targeting overlays visible in the data stream. "These images were never included in the mission archive," I said, letting my voice carry through the silent chamber. "They were removed to protect Orion and whoever signed off on this. The data logs cross-referenced with satellite feeds show our coordinates were relayed in real time, as if my team was part of a controlled experiment. This wasn't a combat operation. It was a field test conducted with live soldiers." I clicked to the next screen, a timeline overlay of the mission, marked with the missing 40 minutes. Here is where our comms cut off. Notice the spike in drone telemetry right before the ambush. Someone knew exactly what was happening to us, and they chose to watch. There was a murmur across the table. I saw General Harris shift uncomfortably, but it was my father I couldn't look away from. He was leaning forward now, his hands gripping his knees. For the first time, the stern mask he always wore was cracking. His eyes didn't carry the judgment I'd known all my life. They carried something heavier, regret. I continued, though my voice grew quieter. "You can call me reckless or unstable, but the data doesn't lie. The men who bled in that jungle were not collateral. They were my responsibility, and I dragged them out of that kill zone because no one else came." My father's gaze dropped to the floor. His jaw tightened, and I saw his knuckles whiten. It was as if he finally understood that my scars weren't symbols of weakness, but the price of being abandoned by a system he once believed in. As I concluded my presentation, a council member cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We've reviewed the contracting documents tied to Orion Systems. There's a signature here that raises concerns." His eyes swept the table before landing on the first row. "Colonel Daniel Morgan, your name appears on the authorization forms for Orion's predictive drone testing program. Can you confirm this?" The room seemed to tilt, my breath catching in my throat. I turned toward my father, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He shifted in his seat, his face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quiet, strained. "I signed off on the technology contract years ago. I believed it was harmless, limited to simulations, not live missions." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. It felt like the air itself had been pulled out. My heart pounded, every muscle in my body tightening. "You signed the contract that allowed Orion into our command structure?" I asked, my voice breaking for the first time. "I didn't know they would use it like this," he said, almost pleading. His eyes finally lifted to mine, and I saw something I had never seen before: fear, shame, and the crushing weight of realization. "I thought it was a training tool, Talia. I thought it would save lives, not take them." The council members exchanged tense glances, whispers passing like sparks between them. I felt anger rising, but beneath it was something more painful: the realization that my father's blind trust had set this nightmare in motion. I stepped back from the podium, my hands trembling slightly. "The men who died on that mission," I said slowly, "did so because someone treated a battlefield like a laboratory. Whether you meant it or not, you helped open that door." My father lowered his head, his broad shoulders sagging. I saw him swallow hard, as though the truth had struck deeper than any bullet. The man who once called me useless now looked as if his own words were tearing him apart from the inside. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, every breath shallow and held. My father sat motionless, but I could see his hands trembling against his knees. For a moment, I thought he would remain seated, stubborn as always. But then he rose slowly, his tall frame seeming smaller under the weight of what he was about to say. "I need to speak," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. All eyes turned to him. My pulse quickened as I watched him grip the edge of the table for support. "I signed the Orion contract," he continued, his tone hoarse, "because I believed in their promise. I believed they would make our soldiers safer, that no one would have to endure the kind of losses I've seen. I was wrong." The room froze. Even Admiral Foster, who had seen countless war rooms and tribunals, sat back in silence. My father's voice cracked as he went on. "I called my own daughter a liability, a useless soldier, because I thought I was protecting the honor of this institution. But the truth is, I failed her. I failed all of you. My blind trust in a contractor's words cost lives, and almost cost hers." I felt my throat tighten, an ache rising in my chest. I had waited my entire life for him to see me, not as a reflection of his expectations, but as myself. Now, watching him stand there, broken and exposed, I wasn't sure how to feel. "I can't undo what happened," he said, his voice faltering. "But I can stand here, before all of you, and admit my mistake. Talia fought harder than anyone in this room could ever imagine. She carried men through fire while I sat behind a desk, believing in a lie." The chamber remained silent. No pens moved, no whispers broke the air. My father's hands shook as he lowered himself back into his seat, his face pale, his eyes glistening with something he would never call tears. In that moment, I realized that the man who had once towered over me now looked utterly human, fallible, flawed, and finally awake to the truth. The Pentagon hearing room was nothing like the tribunal. It felt colder, larger, its walls heavy with the weight of decades of secrets. I sat at a long mahogany table, flanked by Admiral Foster and 2 military legal officers. Across from us, representatives of Orion Systems in tailored suits looked polished and detached, their briefcases lined with rehearsed denials. This wasn't just a military hearing, it was a war over truth, fought with contracts, clauses, and carefully sharpened words. The chair of the Ethics Committee, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, opened the session with precision. "We are here to address allegations of ethical violations, falsification of mission data, and unauthorized human risk trials by Orion Systems," she said, her tone cutting through the air. "Lieutenant Morgan, you will present your account first." I rose, my palms flat against the table to steady myself. "I led a team into what we were told would be a low-risk extraction," I began, my voice calm but unwavering. "Instead, we were used as data points in a live drone experiment orchestrated by Orion Systems. We were monitored, recorded, and abandoned when the situation spiraled out of control. The logs and recordings I've submitted prove this." One of Orion's lawyers immediately interjected. "Your claims are speculative, Lieutenant. Drone mapping systems require real-world data, yes, but your injuries and losses are tragic side effects of unpredictable combat zones, not intentional harm." Admiral Foster leaned forward, his voice like a blade. We've reviewed timestamp discrepancies, deleted logs, and the whistleblower's confession. Your company erased evidence of a 40-minute ambush window. Are you still calling that unpredictable? The room tightened with tension. The committee members scribbled notes, their expressions shifting as the evidence weighed on them. I glanced down the table and caught sight of my father, sitting behind the legal counsel. He didn't look at me, but his hands were clenched, his knuckles white. As I continued presenting drone footage and intercepted transmissions, the room grew still. Orion's confidence wavered. For the first time, I felt the tide turning, not for me, but for the soldiers who had no voice. When it was my turn to speak again, I didn't just address the accusations against Orion, I laid out a solution. This system needs a safeguard, I said, my voice echoing through the hearing room. I proposed the establishment of a new clause, one that ensures no contractor, no algorithm, and no corporate interest will ever place soldiers in harm's way without full oversight. Call it what you want, but I call it the Callahan Clause. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. The clause mandates that any mission involving experimental technology undergo direct review by a board of field officers, men and women who know the stakes on the ground. It requires real-time transparency of data and prohibits live testing with unknowing combat units. No soldier should be treated like disposable hardware. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then the first wave of resistance came, subtle but sharp. A defense contractor representative leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Lieutenant, while your story is tragic, implementing such a clause would slow down innovation and cost millions in project delays. Are we willing to cripple advancements that could save future lives?" I met his gaze without flinching. "How many lives are you willing to sacrifice in the name of efficiency?" I asked. "Because I've already buried men who were treated as data points. Your innovation nearly killed me. You can measure your profits in dollars. I measure them in names I can't forget." Another voice, a congressman with close ties to defense funding, chimed in. "You're asking for a level of oversight that will shake every contract we have with the private sector. This isn't realistic." Admiral Foster stepped in, his tone icy. "What's not realistic is expecting soldiers to trust a system that values corporate timelines over human lives. Morgan's proposal is sound. We've let contractors dictate too much for too long." I stood my ground, my ribs aching under my uniform, but my resolve unshaken. "This isn't just about my team," I said firmly. "It's about every soldier who goes out there believing the system won't betray them. We owe them this clause." Just when the arguments from Orion's side grew sharper and more defensive, Admiral Foster stood, holding a sealed folder. "We've obtained a declassified memo," he said, his voice steady yet laced with steel. "This document comes directly from Orion's internal development team." He laid the papers on the table, and I watched as the council members leaned forward, their eyes scanning the first page. My heart pounded as the words appeared on the screen. Human control variables, live field evaluation, Operation Halberd. The room went still. Foster's voice cut through the silence. "According to this memo, Lieutenant Morgan's team was not only aware to Orion's testing, they were chosen as the control variable. In other words, they were deliberately placed in harm's way to measure the effectiveness of the drone algorithm against actual enemy resistance." Gasps rippled across the chamber. Even the defense contractors who had spoken with such confidence a moment ago looked shaken. I clenched my fists beneath the table, my nails digging into my palms. It was one thing to suspect we had been used. It was another to see it spelled out in black and white. Orion's lead representative stood abruptly, his voice cracking. "That document is being misinterpreted. It was a hypothetical framework, nothing more. We never—" Foster slammed a hand on the table. "Hypothetical? Then why does it reference Lieutenant Morgan's unit by name and match the exact coordinates of her ambush?" The man's mouth opened but no sound came out. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, their silence damning. The committee chair looked at me, then back at the Orion team, her face set like stone. I leaned forward, my voice low but cutting through the tension. "You called us variables, but we weren't numbers on a screen. We were flesh, blood, and trust, and you destroyed all three." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in the eyes of the people who had orchestrated this nightmare. They were cornered, and the truth had finally stripped them of their polished defenses. The final session of the hearing felt different. The committee members spoke with a clarity I hadn't heard before, their voices sharp with conviction. Admiral Foster stood beside me as the chair addressed the room. After reviewing all evidence, including the Orion memo and operational discrepancies, this council hereby approves the proposed reform measure, the Callahan Clause, effective immediately. The words hit me like a wave. For months, I had fought through silence, doubt, and betrayal. Now, standing in that room, I felt the weight of all those nights spent staring at the scars on my ribs. They weren't just symbols of pain anymore. They had become the reason the system would never treat soldiers as test subjects again. I glanced at the Orion representatives. Their faces were ashen, their confident smiles erased. The committee announced that criminal charges would be pursued against individuals found complicit in falsifying mission data. For the first time, I saw justice taking shape, not just as an idea, but as action. That evening, back in my quarters, I found an envelope slipped under my door. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Talia, the letter began. I have no excuses. I believed I was protecting the system, but I see now I was protecting the wrong thing. I was blind to what truly mattered, your courage, your truth, and the men you saved when no one else came. I'm sorry for every word that cut you down instead of building you up. I read the next lines twice. I will testify against Orion. Whatever I once believed, I know now that accountability is the only way forward. You showed me that scars aren't signs of weakness. They are proof of strength I could never see until now. By the time I finished reading, my throat was tight. I folded the letter and placed it carefully beside my uniform. I didn't know if we could repair what had been broken, but for the first time, I believed my father truly saw me. Not as a soldier defined by mistakes, but as the woman who refused to be silent. Late one evening, I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters, the room quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan. I lifted the edge of my shirt, running my fingers along the jagged lines carved into my ribs. The scars felt colder now, like pieces of metal fused to my memory. I could still smell the jungle, the gunpowder, the copper tang of blood. The ambush replayed in my mind, but it no longer consumed me. It simply reminded me why I had fought so hard to bring the truth forward. For a long time, I saw these scars as marks of failure. Now, they were my anchor, proof that survival sometimes means carrying the weight of what almost destroyed you. I thought of Ruiz, Kim, Diaz, how their lives had been cut short or changed forever. I whispered their names under my breath, a quiet promise to never let their sacrifice fade into a footnote. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. It was Admiral Foster's aide, holding an envelope. "Orders for you, Lieutenant," he said with a faint smile. Inside was a formal letter from the Naval Academy, inviting me to lead a new officer training program, focused on ethics, operational readiness, and the hard lessons we had learned from Orion's failures. Reading the letter, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about rank or medals anymore. It was about shaping the kind of leaders who would never let history repeat itself. The offer felt like both a challenge and a calling. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote a single line in my journal. The scars don't define me, but they remind me of the cost of silence. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Training the next generation meant facing my own ghosts every day, but it also meant giving them the strength to fight smarter and harder than we ever could. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The auditorium at the Naval Academy was filled with fresh faces, young officers in crisp uniforms, their eyes wide with the kind of determination I once carried. I stood behind the podium, scanning the room. For a moment, I felt the weight of every scar, every night in the jungle, every lie I had torn apart to stand here now. I took a slow breath and placed my left hand against my side, over the scars that still throbbed faintly when the weather turned cold. "These scars," I began, my voice steady but resonant, "are not medals. They are warnings. They remind me of what happens when trust is broken and when lives are treated as expendable in the name of progress." The room was silent. I could see some of the cadets leaning forward, their pens poised but unmoving. I continued, "I don't stand here to inspire you with tales of heroism. I stand here to remind you that leadership isn't about glory. It's about carrying the weight of others when no one else can. It's about speaking the truth, even when the world calls you a liability." I paused, letting the words settle. I glanced at a young woman in the front row who looked like she might break if someone told her she wasn't enough. "You will be tested," I said softly. not just in combat but in character. Your scars, physical or unseen, will be the marks of what you chose to protect, not what you let slip through your fingers. A wave of quiet energy swept through the room. I saw heads nodding, jaws tightening with resolve. "If you remember nothing else from me," I said, my hand still resting on my ribs, "remember this. Courage is not about being unbreakable. It's about knowing you can break, and standing anyway." The applause was subdued at first, then grew louder, echoing through the auditorium. I stepped back from the podium, not for recognition, but with the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, my scars were finally speaking for something bigger than me. As the applause settled, I caught sight of a figure standing quietly in the back of the auditorium. My breath caught when I recognized him, my father. He was out of uniform, wearing a simple gray coat, but there was no mistaking the broad shoulders that once cast such a long shadow over my life. His eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, were softer now, almost fragile. I watched him as I stepped down from the podium, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. He didn't move at first, as if unsure whether he had the right to approach. When I finally walked toward him, he straightened, his hands clasped tightly, and I saw something I had never seen before, tears glistening in his eyes. "I came to listen," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "Not to speak. I had to hear you for myself. And Talia, I was wrong. All of it, the things I said, the way I doubted you. I thought I was protecting you by being hard on you, but I see now I was just protecting my own pride." Yet the words hit me like a wave, not because they erased the pain, but because they carried the weight of a man who had finally stopped running from his mistakes. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I didn't need you to be proud of me," I whispered. "I just needed you to believe me." He nodded, his jaw trembling. I believe you. I believe in you more than I ever have. And I will spend whatever time I have left, making sure I never fail you again." For a moment, the noise of the room faded, and it was just the two of us. No tribunal, no accusations, no scars except the ones that had brought us here. He reached out, hesitant, and I let him rest a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first step toward something better, something I hadn't realized I still needed. Peace with the man who once defined my world. The hallway outside the Naval Academy's memorial wing was quiet, the kind of silence that felt almost sacred. My boots echoed softly against the polished floor as I walked past the bronze plaques, bearing the names of those who had given everything. I slowed when I reached the newest section, where my name had been etched alongside my team's, not as a monument to death, but as a reminder of what we survived. I traced my fingers over the cool metal, my reflection distorted in its shine. For a long time, I believed my scars were invisible to the world. Now they were part of a story no one could erase. I placed a hand on my ribs, feeling the faint ridges beneath my uniform, and whispered to myself, "Some scars burn, but mine speak louder than any silence." The thought settled inside me like a quiet flame. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy, ensuring the voices of those who never came back would live on through every cadet I trained, every lesson I shared. The Callahan Clause had been signed into military doctrine just last week, and I felt the weight of that change like a promise I'd made to them all. As I left the hallway, I could see the sunset spilling through the tall glass windows, casting golden light across the academy grounds. It felt like the world was breathing again. I took one last look at the plaque and walked forward, my head high, my chest steady. "Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.